You can get Sons of Patriarchy completely ad-free on Apple Podcasts for $4.99 per month or $44.99 per year. This applies to our entire back catalog and every upcoming episode completely ad-free. Listening without interruption. If you don't mind the ads, you can still listen to the series for free on any of your favorite podcast platforms. This revenue helps support Outreach Idaho and helps pay the bills of the series. Now, on to the episode. All right, so we have another subject matter expert. We're calling them. I'll call them intellectual subject matter experts. All that fun stuff. And this one is particularly on Christians in the public square, on political conversations, on all this fun stuff within our Christian nationalist and politics conversation in this series. So if you can introduce yourself, the institutions you've been part of, and the books you've written as well.
Yes, thank you, Peter. My name is David Koizes, and I live in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I was actually born near Chicago and grew up there for my first 18 years. I went to Bethel University, called Bethel College at the time, in Minnesota. That's where I did my undergraduate training. I studied at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and in political theory. I went on to the University of Notre Dame in the 1980s, and that's where I got my PhD. And then for 30 years after that, I taught at Redeemer University College here in Ancaster, Ontario, Canada, not too far from where we live here. I've been retired now for 7 years, and I am working for an organization called Global Scholars Canada. And I'll simply say that there were two major events that pushed me into the study of politics, and one of these was the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, which took place 50 years ago this month, in which all of my relatives on my father's side, who was born in Cyprus, became refugees overnight. That had a big influence on me. And then in the second place was the Watergate scandal and the resignation of Richard Nixon, which also took place 50 years ago this month. And the Cyprus crisis and the Nixon debacle, though those were connected in maybe indirect ways, but they really pushed me towards the study of politics as a young man, and that's what I have followed through since then. I'm the author of three books. The first is Political Visions and Illusions. This was published in the first edition in 2003. It came out in a second edition in 2019. It was endorsed by Tim Keller, which I was very grateful for. In fact, up until about a year before he died, tragically last year, he made several endorsements of my book, which I was very happy to hear. My second book is called We Answer to Another: Authority, Office, and the Image of God. And that's a broader philosophical treatment of the concept of authority, which I think is not appreciated enough, I think, in our post-French Revolutionary Western world, shall I say. My third book is coming out in November of this year. It's called Citizenship Without Illusions. It's a sequel to my first book, and I think Keller's endorsement helped to push InterVarsity Press to publish this third book of mine. And so I'm happy to see this coming out as well. And I've had a number of interviews related to that book. And again, it comes out. I figure that next Sunday it'll be 100 days before the book is published.
There you go. So yeah, you talked about political engagement on culture. So the two books and general topics we want to dive into, especially within our Christian nationalism conversation within Christianity and politics and the public square, political illusions and visions, and then also political visions and illusions is the first
Yes.
one. I got that mixed up, and then
Yeah.
citizenship without illusions, which is a play of the first title. So,
Yeah.
what's
That's it.
generally speaking, what's the And I've read the book, I've watched a
Yeah.
few videos and interviews on this, but if you can kind of summarize political visions and illusions, and especially with Tim Keller's endorsement, which I think put this book on the map for a lot of people because
Yeah.
he's been known for quote unquote third wayism, which is not actually what he
Yeah.
believes, but it's what people think he believes. But
Yeah. Yeah.
what's the general thesis of the book that you want Christians to better engage with politically?
Well, the major thesis is that the various political ideologies are forms of that very ancient phenomenon of idolatry. And this is something that I had suspected for quite a long time before I published the book. So the book, the first edition came out just over 20 years ago, but I started teaching uh, like 37 years ago. And one of the courses that I was charged to teach was something called it was an introduction to political ideologies. And so I looked through, this is before the internet. I had to look through these orange books in print to find a book that would suit what I thought needed to be done at a Christian university in this kind of a course. I couldn't find anything. So in about 1994, I actually started taking notes and started writing chapters that would end up being political visions and illusions. And and it's the connection with idolatry that I was looking for, because that's something that I have long um, been suspicious of even before that time.
Hmm.
People adhere to maybe liberalism or socialism, conservatism, nationalism, what have you, and they find the good things in it. But what they're missing is the deep spiritual roots underpinning the ideologies. That's what I wanted to alert people to. Now, in the second edition of the book, I drew I expanded on that further and talked about the salvation stories that are implicit within the political ideologies. So in the biblical salvation story, we have creation, fall into sin, redemption in Jesus Christ, and the final consummation of the kingdom of God at the return of Christ. Every one of these ideologies, which are products of quasi-Christian civilization, the West, has a kind of redemptive narrative, a salvation story that is either overt, as in Marxism, or else it's covert. It may be implicit if we get into something like liberalism or nationalism or what I would call democratism. So it's a story of how we will save ourselves. And that's what the ideologies promise. They promise a this worldly salvation that we accomplish on our own efforts, and how that will occur over the course of history.
Yeah, my guess is when people are hearing this and they hear that our current political ideologies are the result of our own idolatries,
Yeah,
my guess is they're gonna say to you, Dr. Koizes, well, my political ideology is not the result of an idolatrous, but that
yeah,
other party is the result
yeah,
of an idolatry. What might you say to somebody who's so convinced of their own political leanings and
yeah.
they vilify the other ones and say they're the ones with the problem. I got this stuff right.
Yeah, oh, that's very good. Yeah, because I am thoroughly convinced that the Christian religion, and if we are biblically aware, and if we are aware of what's in our own hearts, we have to look there first. You don't begin by looking in your neighbor's heart, but you have to begin by looking in your own heart. So where are the idols in my own heart? What idols am I maybe only implicitly worshiping? And John Calvin said that the heart is a perpetual idol factory. Saint Augustine said that our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And Augustine, above all of the church fathers, understood very well that we are seeking idols and that we tend to love things, the things in God's creation more than God himself. And we try to combine those in some way with faith in the one God. We think that we can follow an idol in one part of our life while following the true God in another part of our life. So we have divided lives. That's the thing that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, that's that's what we're trying to do throughout this series is not just say, and again, this is we're trying to look at our own hearts and not just say, well, all the Christian nationalists or all the far right or far left people have to deal with their own issues. Like we have to deal with our own issues, and then we have to engage in conversation with all this stuff too.
Yeah.
So a few chapters in your book um, that I want to focus on, especially as it relates to this conversation, is your chapters on conservatism, on
Right.
liberalism, and then on democratism or
Okay.
democracy. Because I
Yeah.
think when people think about conservatism or
Yeah.
democracy in general, or generally speaking, vilify liberalism or progressivism, um, there's an assumption that conservatism is the way that the Bible works politically,
Yeah.
and
Right.
progressivism is the idolatrous. So I think
Exactly.
they would agree that liberalism or progressivism, although it's not classical liberalism, of course,
Yeah.
um, but they would agree that the other side has idolatrous proclivities. But what about conservatism itself has a religious undertone, but not just a Christian undertone?
Yeah. 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 Well, conservatism, it's a little bit different from the other ideologies that I deal with in my book because I really couldn't find a kind of underlying redemptive narrative. So, conservatives do not tell a story
Hmm.
in the same way that socialists or liberals or nationalists do. That by freeing ourselves from our foreign rulers, that we are somehow going to, self-actualize, that we're going to be our nation will achieve glory and so forth. It's not the classless society lies out there in the future. Conservatives don't do that. So but I think what the trouble with conservatism is that it can still become idolatrous because tradition, and tradition is a very good thing. We could not live without tradition. The very fact that that we dress the way that we do, that we drink out of a glass rather than out of our hands. It's these come down from tradition. So we are embedded in tradition, and those people who think that they can rebel against tradition are really plugging themselves into a tradition of rebellion against tradition. So it's inescapable. It's all around us. But that very fact should reveal to us that traditions exist in multiple levels and in multiple kinds. And to say that we defer to tradition means that you bypass a certain um, a certain process of discernment that is necessary if we are going to judge one tradition against another. And it's not to say that we can remove ourselves from traditions and somehow find a kind of position like a vacuum, where we're completely um like a Kantian reason, if you will, that we're divorced from all of these traditions that have shaped us, but nevertheless we still have an obligation to assess the traditions that have come down to us because traditions conflict with each other. So simply to defer to tradition doesn't tell us which tradition we're deferring to. So I would always tell my students when I would teach this course that the book grew out of, if somebody tells you that he's a conservative, the first thing you need to ask him or her is, what are you trying to conserve? And depending on the time and the geographic location, you're going to get sometimes vastly different things, what people are trying to conserve. And some of those things are very good, but a lot of them are not.
Yeah, it's maybe this is making too general of a statement on this, but it sounds like what you're saying to the extreme. It's the
Yeah.
uncritical reception of a tradition that you've received or inherited from your parents or
Yeah.
your society, whatever it is.
Yeah. And I think that's true. Yeah. And of course, you cannot criticize every tradition that's been
Of
handed down
course.
because, any more than we can. Again, I mentioned Immanuel Kant a moment ago, that we can somehow think through the ethics of every decision that we make in life, to see whether we could will that everybody do do this act. We can't do that because most of life, um, most of life, we rely on our intuition, and that's not a bad thing. But at
No.
the same time, there are moments when traditions need to be evaluated and they need to be reevaluated, such as the traditions of racial segregation in the American South. That's
Yeah.
the one that I always allude to. It was a tradition, it was a hallowed tradition, but it was also indescribably cruel
Mhm.
to a huge portion of the population.
Yep. Yep. And another one that I think may shock some, and then I think others in more radical traditions might
Mm,
agree, is your chapter on democracy. People are probably thinking
right.
like, what's the idolatry of democracy? Like, don't we want to have a representative
Yeah,
republic? Don't we want to have
yeah,
majority rule? Like this, how
yeah,
can this possibly have some sort of redemptive undertone
yeah,
that is
yeah,
divorced from the biblical redemptive story?
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you can see that already from the turn of the last century. The progressive movement in the United States, in particular, wanted to try to democratize as much of the political system as they could manage. Woodrow Wilson was part of this. Teddy Roosevelt. It was a cross-party phenomenon. To try to bring the people into the into as much decision making as possible. But in so doing, I think it really threw the Constitution off balance in some rather serious ways. Right, the way that things have developed over the last, well, it's more than half a century now. The 1968 election, when at the end of March of 1968, President Lyndon Johnson decided he was not going to run for the presidency again. Hubert Humphrey was made the vice president, was made the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. Many Democrats were furious because he had not entered any of the Humphrey had not entered any of the primary elections before that. But the primary elections had never been intended to be determinative of who was going to win the nomination. It was simply a kind of test marketing, as it were. But now, the way that things have developed after the reforms of the McGovern-Fraser Commission in the Democratic Party, the Republicans got on side as well, is that there seems to be no real vetting process within the parties to make sure that candidates are qualified and that they for the position and that they have a basic level of personal integrity. And so that is what is missing now from the process in the two major political parties. And I think in many respects it's led to Napoleonic politics, where people are relying on a personality, a particular personality to save the country
Yeah.
to or well to make America great again, if you will.
Yeah.
I think that's not what the founders intended. I think somebody like James Madison would be quite astonished and in a negative way to see the way that the American polity has developed over the succeeding 200 years.
Yeah. And so since I don't want to play favorites or just bat one side,
Hmm.
or just beat one side,
No,
also
no,
I think liberalism or classical liberalism,
yeah,
I think that at least liberalism is, I think in many people's or brains is coterminous with progressivism, although it's not necessarily
it is not.
coterminous with
No.
progressivism. But what are the visions of liberalism proper?
Yeah. Yeah, again, it depends on which liberals you talk to, but I think in general it's a kind of liberating the self from various constraints. You mentioned a classical liberalism. That's the liberalism of John Locke.
Hmm.
Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776. There's a more progressive variety of liberalism in the second chapter of Political Visions and Illusions. I um, I traced the development of liberalism through five stages, and in the second edition of the book, I draw a circle because I think they're doubling back on each other in many respects. Moving away from um, maybe the Hobbesian Leviathan, if you will, kind of absolute monarchs of the early modern period.
Yeah.
It may be that we're moving back in that direction again because so much has been politicized, so much has been, the their the individualism which has been implicit in liberalism all along has metastasized, if you will. It's become much more. It's become toxic, I think.
Yeah.
And it's not. I think I do believe that this classical liberalism, which is sometimes calls itself conservatism, in North America, and the more progressive liberalism are basically of one piece.
Yes. Yeah.
You know,
Agreed.
they have the same underlying assumptions, even though they have developed somewhat differently. So, you know, the more progressive liberals will say, you know, we want to try to liberate the self and the self's desires to the greatest extent that we possibly can. And I think probably the best analysis that I've seen of that recently is Carl Trueman's book,
Mhm.
The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Yeah.
A brilliant book. I think it's in many respects he's doing for I don't know, maybe psychology or for cultural studies, perhaps what I've tried to do in political visions and illusions on the
Hmm.
political side.
Hmm. Yeah. That is a great, yeah, it's a great point. Both sides of the same coin are still individualistic to the core. And
That's right.
which is
Yes.
interesting because you think, yeah,
Well,
conservatism has
yeah.
historically been linked to more like, I mean, I guess they would say communal values or family values or societal values, which is
Yeah.
a little less the case than it is today.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think it was actually two Canadians that I think helped to define the terms because there was a man by the name of C.B. McPherson. He was a Canadian academic who wrote a book called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism.
Hmm.
And he talked about um, that he talked about individualism to the extent that it developed into what we might now call laissez-faire capitalism. You know, maybe a kind of corporate capitalism, as it were. But then on the progressive left, you have something called expressive individualism nowadays. You know, and there was another Canadian by the name of Charles Taylor, who you've probably heard of. Wrote a book called The Secular Age. That's probably his magnum
Yeah.
opus. A number of other books in which he outlined the progress of expressive individualism in terms of people being able to choose their own identities, their pronouns, and everything. You know, and everybody is more or less compelled to go along with that. Um, and you know, even if they have to deny the the evidence of their own senses.
Yeah. Yeah. So now with nationalism, and I'm curious, especially for
Yeah,
nationalism, knowing that this is originally written 20 years ago and then updated 5 years
yeah,
ago,
yeah.
if you if you see differences in current nationalist discourse versus what you wrote on 20 years ago up until 5 years ago.
I don't see a qualitative change to that. I don't think we're seeing something that's majorly different. My own experience with nationalism was with a kind of ethnic nationalism.
Okay.
My father was born in the island of Cyprus. He grew up in the Greek Orthodox community in Cyprus,
Hmm.
and but his best friend was a Turkish Cypriot by the name of Abdullah. You know, and they were best friends. They were born exactly 1 year apart. They shared the same birthday, and Abdullah died 1 year before my father did. You know, my father was just heartbroken when he died. But in Cyprus, there were Greek ethnic nationalists that wanted to unite the island with Greece, which would have been a complete disaster. But that's what they wanted to see happen. In 1974, this was 50 years ago this year, this summer, uh, there was a coup d'état in which the government of Cyprus was overthrown by minions of the Greek colonels, the military dictatorship in Greece, and it looked as though they were going to annex the island unilaterally. Turkey sent a flotilla to northern Cyprus, landed on the island in August of 1974, exactly half a century ago. They expanded their control of the island, and so all of my relatives who live in the north part of the island became refugees overnight. So nationalism for me, it's more than just an academic uh, exercise because I saw what happened to my loved ones as a result of a certain kind of Greek nationalism in the island of Cyprus. You know, so that's the kind of nationalism that I think is quite dangerous.
Hmm.
You know, so when I see somebody like Viktor Orban wearing a scarf that has the old pre-1920 Hungary that's quite a bit larger than it is now, suggests to me that he might have designs on maybe Serbia, Romania, Croatia. That's a very dangerous thing. Vladimir Putin, who wants to try to bring Ukraine back into the Russian orbit by force of arms if necessary. That's the kind of nationalism that's dangerous. But not all nationalisms are like that.
Hmm.
So there's another kind of nationalism which might be somewhat more benign, a kind of civic nationalism in which there's less emphasis on ethnicity, but more on building a nation based on common citizenship,
Mhm.
common passport, maybe common ideals. That's something else. But and I think France, the United States, are probably the best examples of that form of civic nationalism. And so America at its best is inclusive of a variety of different peoples and groups that might define themselves differently over against other peoples.
Mhm.
So a country the size of the United States has a wide diversity of cultures within it. People of different ancestries and so forth. And I think that's a very good thing. But I think that itself can become idolatrous. So just before I moved to Canada back in 1987, my sister and I went to attended, and I don't even remember how we happened to do this, but it was a large mega church not far from Chicago.
Mhm.
It was the Sunday closest to the Independence Day holiday, and we picked up the bulletin, looked through it. The whole service had been turned over to America. National anthems were being played, the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and so forth. We both looked at each other. We got up and we ended up leaving
Mhm.
because I thought that's out of line. There is no way that a church should be engaging um, in that kind of faux piety, kind of misguided piety within the middle of a church service. I don't particularly like to see flags flown in churches, national flags flown in
Same.
churches
Yep.
either. Um, and this is a sort of nationalism that it grabs me in a way. It gets to me. Let me put it that way.
Hmm.
It gets to me. It bothers me in a way that possibly even socialism or conservatism do not. So
Yeah.
just because
Yep.
of my own experience and my own family's experience with it.
Yep. Yep. So last one, and then we'll see kind of how this all gives us a better vision or transcending these visions to a better vision. Socialism, and I think this is one that's relatively vilified by both sides in some way, shape, or form. So I think everyone has at least some agreement that socialism in some way, shape, or form is not just not proper, but can be,
Yeah.
yeah, it can be destructive. But what's the vision, the ideological vision, the idolatry behind socialism
Yeah.
itself?
Yeah, some people will say it's communal ownership of property, but we already have communal ownership of property in a whole variety of forms.
Hmm.
There are lands that are held in trust to the public by municipal governments, state governments, national government, national parks, and so forth. There are various corporate entities, private corporate entities that can be said to own the property. But I think the fundamental error of socialism is to try to consolidate all property ownership into a single form, which has profoundly totalitarian implications. I have no difficulty with the welfare state. Sometimes the welfare state is identified with socialism. I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah.
There's a conservative argument for the welfare state being made by somebody like a Winston Churchill, perhaps not Margaret Thatcher, but certainly within the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. It certainly has been made by members of the Tory Party. Um, but I think socialism it's based on the idea that all property, that all private property can be consolidated into a single form. And along with that comes a redemptive narrative that once we have done that, then we will have saved ourselves.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so before I ask,
It's more explicit in Marx,
yeah, yeah.
and it's perhaps more implicit in other forms of socialism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so before I ask this another question, more of a transcendent question, how how are these various forms of political ideology with their visions, their underlying idolatries, how are these co-opted by Christians or improperly engaged by Christians who are so sold on either conservatism or democratic republicanism or progressive liberalism, where they hold so tightly to a particular political vision. How does that manifest itself in political and religious idolatry, not just at the foundational
Yeah.
level, but at the like the civic level?
Yeah. Well, if you are highly partisan, if you are committed to a particular ideology, you will be unable to see the moments of truth in the opposing ideologies. Because every ideology does have a moment of truth in some fashion. So liberalism, the freedom of the individual, that's a very good thing. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I think we should be thankful that we live in a country that we live in countries in the Western world that that guarantee a variety of personal freedoms. You know, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. In Canada, we have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms from 1982 that has similar protections in there. But at the same time, I think that can become a kind of religion if it takes priority over every other possible consideration, including the communities of which we are part. So liberalism wants to try to make everything into a kind of voluntary association. I think a lot of the confusion that our society nowadays has on marriage is because we cannot think in terms of an institution that exists apart from our wills. You know, and it's true that we choose our marital partners. You know, in that respect, that's there's an element of truth in that. Although my Cypriot grandparents' marriage was arranged back in the early years of the last century, you know, and so I'm only two generations removed from an arranged marriage, but I don't know many people that can say that. Um, but I do think that you know the idea that there is an institution that we have not created ourselves that is given us by God, of which sexual complementarity is an intrinsic feature. That's not something that a society that has been so influenced by liberal individualism can easily make sense of. Now, the fact that marriage was respected for so many generations probably tells us that there were certain surviving elements,
Yeah.
non-liberal elements that survived into a liberal era. Now those are being squeezed out by this liberal notion that virtually every community needs to be recast, re-understood as a mere voluntary association. And if that's the case, then there's no fundamental difference between different kinds of communities anymore,
Yep.
because they're all dependent on the component individuals.
Yeah. So I can imagine when somebody's hearing what you're saying
Yeah.
and they haven't yet gotten to the end of the book, nor your upcoming new book, like it sounds like Dr. Koisis that you're just you're basically vilifying every approach to political ideology. So what on
Yeah.
earth are Christians supposed to do in our
Yeah.
political engagement if it sounds like, whether rightly or wrongly, that we can't so align ourselves with one political party
Yeah.
without being necessarily idolatrous. So they're wondering what do we do if all these have
Yeah.
underlying idolatrous visions? What do we as Christians do?
That's right. That's what I try to come up with some responses in my next book,
Mm-hmm.
Citizenship Without Illusions, which is coming out in November of this year. If you pre-order your copy now, my understanding is that you may have it in hand before the actual release date.
Yep.
So get your orders in early. I do think you know it is possible to get involved in partisan politics, but I think in many respects as Christians we need to maintain a certain emotional distance
Hmm.
from the groups that we're getting involved in. You know, so people who are getting involved in a liberal party in Canada, we have a liberal party, we have a conservative party. We have a New Democratic Party, which is our socialist party, somewhat comparable to the British Labour Party or the German Social Democratic Party. It's possible to get involved in our parties, but we have to do so with us while maintaining a critical stance. And as we do so, we pray that to God and work to make it happen. We pray that the negatives in the party that we've chosen to work with, and we have to admit that there are negatives, that we can work to somehow lessen the impact of those negatives. And if you are involved in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, whichever side you decide to work on, then you have to be aware of the negatives in your particular party and to try to work to mitigate those to the extent possible. And I would suggest that you'd probably better get involved with other Christians because you're not going to be able to do this by yourself.
Yeah. So as I conclude, and I'll ask you for any final thoughts.
Yeah.
But if you can talk to, because this series is directed not because we don't agree, but because it just tends to be where these ideas come from, the very ultra conservative, potentially far right um, political spectrum. Can you talk to them on their fears um, of doing exactly what you just said? Because if we move anywhere, and I
Yeah.
think in their minds, if you move anywhere from conservative politics, from either Republican or whatever that looks like across the world,
Yeah.
if we move anywhere far from that, we are moving away from the Bible itself. That anything outside of
Yeah.
that is not biblical, and therefore, if we admit any good in another party, we're I guess implicitly admitting that there's some fault within our own biblical understanding
Right.
of political engagement. So, can you talk to those more particularly on the
Yeah.
quote unquote conservative side, who
Right.
are fearful of doing exactly what you just said?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I don't know that they're the people who are really persuaded of their political position. I doubt that they can be easily dissuaded. But at the same time, if I had to give the one piece of advice, I would say back off of it. Okay, immerse yourself in the scriptures. Read the scriptures carefully. Read people who have read and interpreted the scriptures, and rethink your own commitments. Because if you're simply acting out of if people who are reacting to things, people who are simply um, um, uh, people who are uh, who are acting out of fear are probably not going to take the trouble to think through things in a spiritually discerning way. Now, I said a moment ago that most of our lives we act intuitively. Okay, and we really have no choice. We can't think through everything we do, but at a moment of crisis, you have to think things through. If you come to a point where you are vilifying members of your fellow members of the body of Christ, it may be that you need to think through your own priorities. And we hope that the others will do the same thing with their own priorities and their own commitments. And if that's the case, then we may have to think, oh, wow, I believe this. I don't think that's particularly biblical anymore. And this is why. And then you start moving in a different direction. And I would hope that it would move Christians closer to each other. I would love to see some kind of a political party that, if not overtly Christian, at least one that would be open to Christian influence in some fashion. Now, in the United States, there's something called the American Solidarity Party
Yep.
that's been around for a few years that has been trying to do that. If I were living in that country, I might be more inclined to get involved with them because I
Yep.
think, if they start on the local level and try to build up from there, they might have a chance to supplant one of the major political parties in the United States. I think a change in the electoral system in both Canada and the United States is really important because if there were an electoral system that was based more on proportional representation, such as in most European countries they have them, it would allow the two major political parties to die if they are no longer doing what they should be on the in the political arena. And the last time that really happened was just in the run up to the American Civil War,
Hmm.
and of course we don't want to see that happen again.
No, we
But
don't.
that's right. But there's such a divisive quality to American politics right now. It's a scary thing, and the United States doesn't look like the same country that I left behind almost four decades ago. And that scares me, to be honest. And I find myself sometimes on the verge of tears when I see what's happened there. And I think if there were an electoral system that would allow other parties to have an impact on the political process, I think there are huge numbers of Americans that would abandon the Republicans and the Democrats for these other parties, that would have a space within the Congress, at least within on the congressional level. Presidency would be something else that would have to be worked out. But if the Democrats have become, I in this next book, I say at one point that the Republicans and the Democrats have become diseased parodies of their former selves.
Yep.
I wasn't sure that my editor was going to allow me to leave that in there, but she did. So,
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I think if it were not for our current political discourse, that may not have made it past editing rounds, but because of our current
yeah,
political discourse, it makes it past.
I think so. Maybe so. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So actually, this was my last question because I should have asked this earlier, but I didn't think about it. And you even brought it up, and this is part of your project.
Yeah.
Um, how does the biblical redemptive storyline of creation, fall, redemption, consummation, both critique these various political ideologies, but then also say, well, you got some of it right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And this is what, some people ask me, are you advocating another kind of ideology?
Yeah.
Are you some kind of a transformative vision, as it were? And I would say, not exactly. What I'm really advocating is keeping our eyes open,
Yeah.
and recognizing the reality of what I call societal pluriformity, which means that, in one fashion or another, the various ideologies are monistic in the sense that they try to reduce the diversity of the social fabric to maybe one single principle. And I think what we need to recognize is what I call societal pluriformity. That our societies are made up of multiple communal formations of different sorts, of different kinds. And if we recognize that and recognize that each of these needs to be treated justly, then that would enable us to see past the ideologies and to recognize that families need to be treated as families, schools need to be treated as schools, businesses need to be treated as businesses, labor unions as labor unions, and on down the line. Because each of these has its own place. I don't think we can say that God created the limited liability enterprise. We don't do that. But nevertheless, because we are culture forming creatures, we that God has implanted those potentials within us from the very beginning. And as society has moved through history, these have flowered in a way that they may not have in the more distant past. So slavery is a thing of the past, and we're thankful for that. Feudalism is a thing for the past. We move into a more differentiated society in which there's a pluriformity of different kinds of structures, and each of these needs to be done needs to be treated justly. And I think if we had a political party that would recognize that,
Hmm.
rather than trying to say, let's build the classless society, or let's try to realize the maximum amount of personal freedom that we possibly can, even at the expense of all of these communal formations. If we could move beyond that, we would be much better. And it's not so much as trying to impose a new vision on society as telling people, open your eyes, wake up, look at the diversity that's around us, look at this pluriformity, and let's do it full justice.
Yeah. Um, sorry, this brought up another question just because I think it's relevant
Yeah,
to the discourse. And it's because of
sure.
what you just said. I think, at least on, again, I don't mean this because I'm only attacking this, but because they do tend to be more identified with Christianity, is
Yeah,
the ultra conservative or far right, whatever people want to describe it, which is what I think is
yeah,
the disease of the Republican Party,
yeah,
is this. where they look, and you can even say on the other side on the disease of the democratic, I think there's a similar
Yeah,
sentiments, but just expressed differently. Um, what you just said on societal pluriformity, I think
yeah,
that is a vilified term. Anything that's
mm,
pluralistic, anything that has a pluriformity, anything that allows different societies, different cultures to be part of the same nation and to
yeah,
express themselves in whatever way that they see fit or according to the law.
yeah.
Why is it a good rather than a thing to be feared?
It's a good because I think schools have an important function to play in in our children and young people's development towards full adulthood. I believe that families have an important role to play because that's the incubator of adults who are living according to the way that God has created them to live. I think that a variety of voluntary associations have their own place as well, and I think we need to recognize them. We don't live in a kind of tribal society where there's one chieftain who makes all the decisions over everything. There were experiments with that in the mid 20th century. We now know that as totalitarianism. It's not a pretty picture. You don't want to live under that kind of a society. We want people to have a diverse loyalties that they need to keep in balance in some way. And when they do that, they will presumably be less likely to attach their ultimate loyalty to any one thing in God's creation.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point.
You know?
Um, so if you can leave the listeners of this series and maybe specifically so within your own area of research or whatever you might want to
Yeah,
say, and if you can touch on within that Christians who are trying to figure out, they look at the two different political parties,
yeah,
at least in America, and in whatever political parties there are in other countries
yeah,
across the world, and they
yeah.
think, well, these are my only two options. These are the only two ways that I can engage
Right,
in
right.
society, and they're trying to figure out how do I engage in a way that is
Yeah,
honoring to the redemptive story and looks at the good in these and the bad in these and makes
yeah,
informed decisions. So if you can touch on that, but also anything that you want to leave those listening with.
yeah. I guess I would say that the vote is not the most important way that you can exercise your responsibilities as citizens. So when I was writing this next book, Citizenship Without Illusions, I somewhat surprised myself because I found myself more than I had intended before I started writing it, focusing on the local level.
Hmm.
And I think in many respects, those that's the level in which we are going to see um, the most impact from our activities. To better our own neighborhoods, to better the communities in which we are living. And I have a number of examples in this next book about people who have had an impact, even though they might not necessarily have had an overtly political purpose in what they were doing. And I think citizenship is something that's um, much more diverse than just voting every 4 years or every 2 years or however often elections take place in your country. And it may be that when the two parties are as diseased as they are in the United States, maybe to somewhat lesser extent in Canada, but I'm not sure that we're that far behind. Then it may be that you have to hold your nose, vote for one party, or else vote for a minor party as a kind of protest vote. I think that's entirely legitimate to do. And then at the same time, then get involved in your own community and try to be a force for healing amongst the people where God has placed you.